Chapter 5 of Memories, Part 2.
Spread out, Delta formation, trails take point.
The quiet splashing of the submarine bobbing in the water drifted behind Rainbow Dash as she took her spot on the left trailing edge of the formation, quickly drowned out by the overlapping echoes of armored hoofsteps. 5 pale beams of illumination danced ahead of the party, jittering like nervous fairies with each step as they pulled the world out of the pitch-black night of Canterlot. She glanced to her right to Applejack's position on the far side of the formation, but her old friend was nearly invisible to her. If not for the light cast from the cowpony's shoulder and the dim glow of her helmet's visor, it would have been impossible to pick her out of the darkness. Rainbow suppressed a shiver as she turned her attention forwards once more. In spite of all her previous efforts, this was the first time she had left the relative safety of the submarine, and the experience was enough to make her heart quicken all on its own. She had grown used to half of her world being taken by void, but now she had even less. The armor dulled nearly every sound into quiet vibrations that left her breath ringing like thunder in her ears, and the cone of light cast from her shoulder was barely wide enough to fill what little space she could see past her helmet. Rainbow had never coped well with small spaces. Sometimes even her old home in Ponyville had been too small for her, but she had always been free to spread her wings and take flight in those days. Now she was trapped in this coffin of metal, and although the armor allowed her to stretch her wings, she was acutely aware of the stiff cast that encased them. Why hadn't Twilight ever warned her about this? What would happen if she just stopped walking? Would the others even notice if she shut her light off and fell behind, or would she be left alone in the dark, isolated, waiting for the dead air to consume her? She jumped at the crack of static in her ear, followed by Sea Saber's voice.
Hold here.
They had reached the edge of the city. Star Trails and Flintlock each crouched low, watching different directions while Saber hunched over a bundled-up shape on the ground. As Rainbow drew closer, she identified it for what it was. A changeling corpse, the cracked pieces of its shell hanging limply around its hollowed frame. Applejack stepped up to Rainbow's side.
Y'all see something?
Saber nodded. She flipped a piece of chitin over, shining her light on the last strips of meat inside.
See these teeth marks? Flat, like a pony's teeth.
Heat rose in Rainbow's breast, and she couldn't keep the accusatory tone out of her voice when she spoke.
What are you trying to say? You think Twilight did this?
Saber shrugged as she straightened up.
I can only make observations and state my knowledge, and I know that changelings don't have any flat teeth. It's best that we keep moving.
She looked between Applejack and Rainbow Dash.
Do you two have any ideas as to where we should look first?
Rainbow exchanged a glance with Applejack.
I, don't really know my way around the city that well.
I'm afraid I ain't too familiar with it either,
Applejack said.
I reckon she'd head for a library or maybe her folks' old home. Somewhere she'd feel safe.
Aren't you two supposed to be from here?
Flint grumbled. Rainbow snorted, turning to glare at his back.
I'm from Cloudsdale, Flint. I've only been to Canterlot twice, and the second time was when the changelings attacked.
Why don't we try the castle first?
Applejack stepped between the two, her tone diplomatic.
Twilight seemed to feel pretty cozy there, and at least we know how to get there. It's better than nothing,
Saber said.
We'll see if we can find any more clues along the way.
Or some salvage,
Flint groused.
Sure as I didn't find any last time.
Trails chuckled over the radio as she stood up and began leading the way, the white spiral of her suit's horn glowing softly.
Oh, give it a rest, Flint.
With the decision made, the 5 ponies slipped back into formation and pressed deeper into the ruins. Rainbow played her light over the buildings on either side of the cracked street, peering past the broken windows and empty doorframes and trying to imagine how they had looked in their prime. She had never known Canterlot as much more than a silhouette in the sky, and at this point she had spent nearly as much time traversing its ruins as she had navigating its streets under the light of the sun, dodging ponies that pranced past her with their noses turned up in disdain.
So, have we got a plan for if we find Twilight?
Star Trails asked as she led them between two halves of a collapsed building. A faded sign hung askew from the front, depicting an ecstatically grinning pony pointing at the broken end.
We assess her for any symptoms of weird corruption,
Saber said.
If she remains open to peaceful negotiation, then we'll bring her in. Otherwise, we'll terminate her.
Whoa, what?
Rainbow sped up, cutting in front of Saber.
Terminate her? Bring her in? What are you talking about?
She's a threat, Rainbow,
Saber said, stepping around her.
To herself and others. Even if she agrees to come back to Hightown, I'm not going to let her roam around my ship unwatched.
Applejack cleared her throat, drawing their attention.
What's all this weird business y'all are going on about anyway?
She asked.
I know you said Aloysius is one of them, but I admit I still don't quite know what it means. It's the handy-dandy catch-all term for anything that's been corrupted by the ocean,
Trails explained.
We use it for all the ugly odds and ends they are bound to come across if you dive deep enough or long enough.
There's a few stories about ponies turning into weirds,
Flint added. He kept his gun pointed at the ruins as he slowly scanned the windows.
I never put much stock in them, but your friend seems to fit.
Hang on, so y'all are telling me that you never seen something like this before?
Applejack asked.
Are y'all just as lost as we are?
All 5 ponies crouched down as a thunderous dragon roar passed over the city, dislodging loose stones around them and making Rainbow's teeth chatter. She looked up towards the source, narrowing her eye in a vain attempt to pierce the darkness.
What was that?
Dragon.
Flint said.
Definitely the dragon.
A purple star suddenly burst into being atop a distant tower, the slim structure glowing like a giant torch rising up out of the shadowed city beneath. Lashes of green fire flared up past the shattered top of the tower, and the twinkling purple star was thrown out into the open air with a shower of rubble and a distinctive feminine scream.
Twilight!
Rainbow took a step forward, her wings flaring as if to take off, but the armor weighed her down. She could only watch as a massive purple dragon soared out of the tower and dove down after the light, spewing a torrent of green fire from its maw. A chorus of changeling calls raced around the city, some barely audible howls in the distance, while others seemed to come from right on top of them. Rainbow glanced behind her at the sound of scrabbling hooves and caught a glimpse of a dark form jumping towards her. She cried out and instinctively lashed out with a wing. The changeling shrieked as the hardened spike on her wing joint collided with the skull, and it fell to the ground with a thud, perfectly still. Flint's repeater spat fire as he stopped another changeling dead in its tracks.
Looks like dear light woke up the whole damn city.
Horse apples!
Applejack cursed as she twisted in place, eschewing the shotgun at her side and opting to instead buck the changeling that pounced her with both hind legs. It crumpled like a sack of potatoes, letting out a wheezy hiss.
Twilight needs us, y'all! Stay together, ponies!
Saber barked.
Trails, find us around to that tower! Got it, boss!
The tinkle of Star Trail's magic was barely audible under the commotion as her javelin zipped through the air, spearing changelings in the chest before pulling back for another blow. The white lining around her horn glowed as she angled her head towards the tower before jumping into motion.
Follow me!
Rainbow's heart pounded in her ears as she followed after the unicorn. The hissing of changelings and the stomping of hooves seemed to chase her as she raced through the ruins of Canterlot, growing ever closer to the sound of the dragon's wrath. For a moment, Twilight was in freefall. She tumbled through the air, the chest containing the elements clutched with all 4 hooves, eyes squeezed shut, and mind focused solely on the life-preserving orb of magic around her. Her panicked screaming cut off with a grunt as she collided with something solid, and it was all she could do to hang on to the pain in her horn as she bounced off. She shoved every sensation aside but that pain, her beacon in the whirlwind of confusion, and with it as her bulwark, she held the spell together. She couldn't even remember why she needed it anymore. All she had left was the terrified animal instinct to survive.
Get up!
Midnight's harsh voice cut through the blinding pain, pulling her back to the shores of consciousness.
I said get up, damn you!
Twilight blinked her eyes open. Midnight was standing over her, its blood-stained face framed by the jagged remains of a shattered roof. She groaned as she forced herself off the hard floor with shivering legs, flinching in alarm when the element's chest fell to the ground with a loud clatter. Thunder roared overhead, and it wasn't until a loose pebble bounced off Twilight's muzzle that she remembered her situation. Her heart skipped a beat as she scooped the elements into her magic and frantically scanned her surroundings in search of escape.
Oh no! Eyes forward, fool!
Twilight's head turned of its own accord, looking up at the hole she had fallen through just as a clawed hand as large as her entire body tore the rest of the roof away. Green fire rushed toward her, and Twilight could only watch in shock as Midnight appeared in front of her, brandishing an arcane shield. The inferno splashed around the glittering lavender barrier like a wave breaking on the coast, sweeping past her close enough to singe her fur. The fire broke, and Twilight roared back at the fearsome dragon peering down at them, the shield shattering and forming into a lance of energy. With a gasp, Twilight reasserted control, holding the attack back.
Stop! You'll hurt him! Let us go, you suicidal idiot!
Midnight rounded on Twilight with fire in its eyes, fangs bared with fury. At the same time, the deadly bludgeon that was Spike's tail came crashing through the wall, and Twilight shrieked as she threw herself to the side. The stones groaned in complaint at the punishment, and Twilight's stomach lurched at the sensation of the floor sliding underneath her. Realizing that the building was collapsing, she scooped up the elements in her magic and raced for the nearest window. She let out a strangled cry as she leapt through the frame, plummeting a dozen feet to the street below, as the falling structure kicked up a choking cloud of dust.
What are you doing, little flower?
Midnight spat. Twilight scrambled off the ground, coughing with one hoof held to her muzzle as her sneering shadow approached her.
You're going to get us both killed! We can't hurt him!
Twilight shot back.
He doesn't know what he's doing! I know what he's doing! He's trying to kill us! No, it's the corruption! My Spike is still in there!
A powerful gust of wind blew through the street, nearly throwing her off her hooves as it carried the cloud of dust away. Twilight and Midnight both looked up to watch Spike land heavily on the cracked cobblestones in front of them, the darkness fleeing in terror as small gouts of green flame burst from his nostrils. His deep, rumbling growl was so powerful that Twilight felt as if her eyes were about to shake out of her skull, and a cloud of thick purple magic seeped from his eyes as they darted between the two mares. Twilight's eyes widened.
He can see us! He can see both of us! Oh, finally! I can speak to something on my own terms!
Midnight stepped forward, its legs spread and its back straight.
Stand down, creature! I will not hesitate to end you!
Spike snarled at it, lunging forwards with jaw stretched wide. Midnight's horn flashed brilliant lavender just as his teeth went to snap closed around it, and he reared back with a howl of pain. Twilight gaped at the exchange in shock. She could feel her magic twisting about unbidden, feel her limbs moving of their own accord, even as she stood back and watched from a few steps away. Her blood went cold as she realized that she was losing control of her own body, and Spike could be the one to pay for it if she didn't stop it soon. She stomped her hooves against the ground, putting as much command into her voice as she could muster.
Stop!
She blinked, and now it was her standing in front of Spike's towering form. He glowered down at her as Midnight hissed furiously in her ears.
If you won't let me strike at the beast, at least don't stop me from defending ourselves!
Spike lashed out with a claw, and Twilight raised a hasty shield. The shield shattered on impact, sending her stumbling down the street with a cry of pain. A weak groan escaped her as she rolled clumsily onto her hooves, blinking past the blood dripping in her eyes to watch Spike stalk towards her. The blow had thrown her nearly to the end of the street.
Twilight! Hang on!
Twilight frowned, confused.
Rainbow Dish?
She looked behind her, and her heart sank. Rainbow practically fell to the ground at Twilight's side, one armored hoof reaching out to touch at her lost friend's bloodied face. She couldn't keep her voice from cracking as she pushed the words out past her grin.
We found you!
Twilight stared back at her with wide eyes, her jaw hanging loose. And Rainbow's grin faltered as she noticed the pointed fangs framing the unicorn's mouth. After several seconds, Twilight seemed to regain her bearings.
You're not supposed to be here. What do you mean?
Rainbow asked. She tried to pull her into a hug, but Twilight danced away.
We came looking for you!
Twilight jumped as the rest of the dive team finally caught up, their armored hooves kicking up a small cloud of dust.
No! I'm supposed to be alone!
Sea Saber galloped past them, Star Trails and Flintlock fanning out to either side of her and forming a line between them and the growling dragon as she barked orders over the radio.
Flint! Load the Hornbane rounds! I love it when you let me shoot the expensive ones. Trails, find me a weak spot. Already looking, boss. Looks like an old wound on his rear right leg that isn't healed right. Rainbow, keep that mare under control.
Saber glanced back for just a moment before turning her attention back to Spike, steam hissing from her armor as a port opened on her shoulder. He flared his wings in response, matching the sound with a hiss of his own.
We'll handle the dragon.
What are they doing?
Twilight asked, stepping towards them. She grimaced, nearly falling over, and her next words came out in a harsh sneer.
Too weak to stand, little flower?
Applejack stepped in front of her, lending a shoulder to catch her weight.
Oh. Howdy there, Twilight. Hell no, you had us worried sick.
I told you not to follow me!
Twilight's voice was hoarse and accusing as she pushed the cow pony away and stumbled past her.
They're beneath us. Let us focus on the matter at Hoof. Don't talk about my friends like that! It matters not. I will vanquish the beast. No, shut up!
Rainbow exchanged a look of concern with Applejack. She spared a glance towards Spike and saw the dragon steadily crossing the distance towards the group, his head bobbing side to side as he sized up the newcomers. Gingerly, she laid a hoof on Twilight's back.
Twi? Who are you talking to? What?
Twilight spun around, her eyes wide.
You can't hear it?
Slow down, Sugar Cube.
Applejack said softly.
We've got ya.
Twilight squeezed her eyes shut and looked away, muttering under her breath.
Of course you don't hear it. Stupid, stupid. I've been talking to it out loud all this time.
A roar from Spike drew Rainbow's attention. She watched the dragon rear up and flare his wings, raising a claw high to crush the three divers.
Fire and maneuver!
Saber shouted. Flint's repeater spat fire, the bullet zipping into Spike's hind right leg and flashing on impact like miniature shooting stars. Star Trails' javelin sprang forth next, piercing the ragged scales left behind by the barrage of gunfire and drawing a frustrated hiss from the dragon. A jet of steam vented from Saber's suit as she launched a weighted bola at the injured leg, the balls barely reaching enough to wrap around once before they began to buzz with electricity. Spike screamed as his leg finally gave out, and the three divers each darted in different directions as his gargantuan head crashed to the ground where they had been standing. Rainbow felt a pang of sympathy as she watched his eyes roll about in his head, smoke curling from his mouth as he gnashed his teeth in fury. She clicked her radio on.
Saber, you're going to kill him!
That's the plan, Rainbow!
Saber said, breathing hard.
There's only room for killers and corpses in the ocean, and I'm not letting my ponies die!
Twilight was huddled up on the ground, muttering words under her breath too quiet for Rainbow to hear. Her eyes locked on the battle in front of them. Sea Saber rushed out of cover, her wing blades catching the flickering light of Spike's fire and pouncing towards his head. There was a flash of lavender light, and Rainbow yelped as she was thrown back to the ground hard enough to knock the breath from her. When she rolled back to her hooves, gasping for breath, she saw Twilight standing protectively in front of Spike, glaring at each of the ponies sprawled out in the ruins around her. Her pupils turned to dark slits.
He is ours! Twilight, no!
Rainbow ran forwards, heart pounding in her ears.
This could be it. Please don't make me choose. Just calm down. Stay down, Rainbow!
Rainbow grunted in pain as she was forced to the ground face first by an unseen force.
I don't want to hurt you.
Change of plans.
Saber's voice was strained but calm over the radio.
Go for the unicorn first. We'll get the dragon next.
We have to save him. We must destroy him. I won't let you hurt him. He will kill them all if we don't, or they'll kill him. We can subdue him if we act as one. Nobody else has to die. We have the power to stop it.
Together, Twilight and Midnight looked up. They saw Spike on the ground, one bleeding hind leg splayed up behind him as he was peppered with gunfire and gored by a floating javelin. They watched Sea Saber bound towards him, her blades bared like fangs sinking towards his throat. Calling on their magic, they teleported between the two, throwing the armored ponies back with a wave of force powerful enough to daze, without crushing the soft bodies inside. They looked to each pony in turn, and Midnight cast its voice out over them.
He is ours! Twilight, no!
Rainbow Dash, quick as ever, was the first to bounce back to her hooves. She ran towards them at full speed, wings half extended.
Just calm down!
Rainbow hissed in irritation, but Twilight intervened, pinning her friend in place with an arcane force that should keep her safely out of harm's way.
Stay down, Rainbow! I don't want to hurt you!
With a sharp glance towards Applejack to ensure she didn't try to interfere, they turned to Spike. The dragon spewed fire, and they deflected the blast with an unflinching wall of magic. He propped himself up off the ground with his forelegs, his rear end still dragging limply through the stones, and met their gaze with a deep growl. The clouds of dark magic stemming from his bloodshot eyes pulsed with light, and Twilight winced as she felt a sharp pressure on the inside of her skull. She thought back to her confrontation with Aloysius, when she had faced a very similar attack, but it wasn't nearly as overwhelming as it had been then. Midnight laughed, stretching their lips into a prideful sneer.
Is that all you have, dragon? I'd expected a challenge.
Their magic twisted in strange ways, alien to Twilight, and she watched as Spike flinched back, jets of flame spewing from his snout as he glared defiantly into their eyes.
What are you doing to him?
Twilight asked.
What is this magic? He is in too, as we are. I can feel it,
Midnight said. They stepped closer as it spoke, driving him back.
But both his halves are weak in spirit. His darkness is like a wild animal, fleeing craven before my power.
Twilight turned the words over in her racing mind. If there were two halves to him like there were to her, then that meant that her Spike had to still be in there. And if Midnight was able to drive the dark mind inside him away, then that meant...
Spike!
Twilight reached a pleading hoof out towards the dragon, Tears budding in her eyes as she saw his massive green eyes flinching in pain.
I'm here, Spike! You found me! See how he submits to our strength.
Midnight boasted, stretching their face into a wide grin.
Submit to us, dragon! Bow!
Midnight pushed them towards him, pressing even more magic against his mind. Slowly, the malice in his eyes gave way to pain, and then from pain to fear, as the ancient dragon gave ground. He scrabbled backwards like a cornered animal, unable to truly escape with his lame leg.
Stop it!
Twilight clenched their jaw, reasserting her will. Midnight gasped as their magic was cut off, the swirling energies that had surrounded their horn fizzling out with a colorful spark of energy.
What are you doing? We have him! He's not some monster to subjugate!
Twilight said sternly.
He's my #1 assistant, and I want him back!
The ruins had fallen deathly still. Twilight looked up to Spike with one hoof gingerly outstretched, and he looked down at her with wide, fearful eyes. They were not the eager eyes of the young Drake that had helped her sort books in simpler times, nor the clever eyes she had imagined in the mature dragon that had grown up in the dead city as he searched for her. But they were also not the hungry, malicious eyes of the monster that had chased her and her friends out of Canterlot what felt like forever ago. They were confused, caught between the instincts of flight and fight. They reminded her of when he was barely a hatchling, a little bundle of energy that barely came up to her shoulder when she was just a filly, and who seemed to approach every new object wondering if he should eat it or run away.
As long as you can hear your own thoughts, you're still yourself,
Twilight said softly. Slowly, she laid her hoof against the hot scales of his nearest leg, staring up into his eyes.
You remember, don't you? You'll always be my #1 assistant.
He held her gaze for a long moment, plumes of smoke chuffing from his snout with every thunderous breath. Twilight heard a hiss of steam behind her. Spike jerked his head around with a curious snort, looking away. Following his gaze, Twilight turned to see Star Trails crouched low, the javelin thrower built into her shoulder aimed for her heart. The javelin flew forth with a sharp twang, and Twilight cried out as Spike's claws flashed into motion.